This is what 14 episodes of Built in Public looks like. A farmer sends a text or a photo, the bot classifies it, calls the right agent, runs an independent review, pulls in live weather and real farm data from a field, and either sends advice or routes the farmer to someone who can actually see the field, right? So all of that works now. But 6 months from now, or whenever someone else opens this project, none of it is self explanatory, right? Just by reading the code, they cannot just understand how to maintain this project. So, the last thing we will do in this series is a file that makes the reasoning readable after I have moved on from the project or whatever that role was. So, let's have a look at that. When you open a project with Claude Code, the AI powered coding assistant in the terminal, it reads a file called CLAUDE.md. So here we're going to open CLAUDE.md. Everything in this file is going to shape how the agent is going to behave in your code base, what the project does, how it's structured, what it can change on its own, or what it needs to check with you first. It's not documentation for humans, though it also works that way, right? You can also read the CLAUDE.md to see how the project is if you're an engineer or a consultant, but mostly it's for Claude to do things autonomously, right? And so for a bot like this, making the wrong change, say in some credential or a schema, can undo a lot of things, and guessing is a problem. So here's our one paragraph description of the project overview. The agent immediately gets a lot of context about this, and the architecture is giving you the entry point, the routings, those get and posts, functions that we kept visiting. And in our project, it was entirely synchronous. You message once and you get a message back. And in the future, this person might have this phase one and queuing the jobs, which means a lot of people are asking questions. You're going to queue it and then respond one by one. So in the message flow section, we have our main way to get the message from the user, classify it, see if it's off topic, see if it's a greeting, and then use our routing agent to see if it's the crop disease or the farm strategy and give it that. This was what we spoke about on how to clarify the subject, right? We use Haiku to classify the actual message, and then Sonnet to do the heavy lifting of what the answer should be. And then the main sections for classify them, which these are the helper functions that do all the work before Claude makes their API calls. We saw classify message was classifying it to the right handler, and then the actual handler itself, either the in-field disease related in the weeds stuff, which is very high detail, very technical, structured JSON output with handle crop disease, and then the more conversational big picture strategy question like the handle farm strategy. And then we had our should escalate, which is when something's really wrong and the agent shouldn't be engaging with the farmer user. So these are our key functions. We spoke about how we did our storage, right? We had 10 turns for the chat before it starts losing the conversational history. We had the state of the diagnosis, which is the conversation it needs to know for different agents to pick up context, and then the profile that gives the location and so on for where this person is, because tomorrow someone might use this in a different country or different part of the same country. So this is saying that don't change these names without updating every function that reads or writes up, because that's a cascading effect. These are all the environment variables that help us authenticate ourselves with Google, with WhatsApp, with Anthropic, with Upstash, and with Vercel. So all of that is mentioned there. We have the rough tool for linting and for formatting. That's just to keep the code neat. And then the actual AI integration, where we have these, where we specify which model goes for which function with Haiku and Sonnet, and we are using their Python SDK because most of the code base is written in Python. And here we come to the important part, right? What you can safely change. right? So you can change the system prompts and the farm strategy prompts based on whoever is now leading this project, right? They may think that needs to be some change in it. They can also change like the sheet ranges of that Google Sheets file that I showed. That can change quite a lot based on how they want to show their numbers. And then everything that you should check, right? You want to make sure that you have that multilingual capabilities. Check that. And the the crop diagnosis was our independent agent. It intentionally has no access to the conversational history. It's by design. Plus, more things to not do autonomously and just stuff with the webhook and the testing, right? So these were the tests we did in one of the episodes, deployment and PR instructions. So that you can see that this is a very detailed file. So let's see if this is really working. So I'll open the Claude code which resides inside the VS Code, and now we're gonna just ask, right? This is one question I already asked. What does the bot do? And now it read the CLAUDE.md file and said this is everything it does. And then now I'm going to say something that someone new might say, which is I want to add a handler for questions about market prices. What should I touch? So we have some indication of this with our farm strategy. It doesn't talk about pricing, but this is a commercial and strategy kind of mixed question, like mixed feature. And now we want to know what functions in the code base it's going to affect. So it should give an answer that involves our current, so as we thought, it should be consistent with the farm strategy. It should maybe have a classifying mechanism with the classify message. Does it, and now it's asking question, does it need a real data source? It has no market price access. Now, if there's a website that publishes daily market prices, and if there's an API, we should get that. Or if someone's just noting down the prices and adding it just for one crop, we can do that manually and add the file. And it also says what not to touch, right? Don't touch do get, don't touch escalate, don't touch validate and parse response, because some of these have no relation with checking with market prices. So the assistant is understanding the code base well enough to suggest the right change without touching anything that it does not need to change, right? That's what the constraint sections in CLAUDE.md for. It's not to limit like what the tool can do, but to make sure it only changes the things that you ask for change, right? So let's walk through what we actually build in a more conceptual or visual manner so that we understand why each piece is the way it is. So here we have our farmer. This person is on WhatsApp having a one-on-one call, and they will then meet the webhook file functions. That's the first thing that will happen. And this would go through Vercel. It will come to the language detection mechanism, and the bot will mirror the language that they ask in, and then it will go to classify message. Everything downstream depends on the correct routing. If a disease question reaches the strategy handler, the response might be reasonable. It's wrong for the wrong reasons. So you can't really evaluate the agents until you know that the messages were correctly routed, right? If they get the wrong subject, then they're going to fail their tests. So the classifier comes first, and it has its own test files before the agents exist. So we do a bunch of testing at this particular spot, and the main handlers they're separate from each other. They have different output formats, different failure modes, and different tool accesses. So if we keep them separate, then you can rewrite the disease prompt without affecting much the strategy prompt. And they do share the same upstash storage, but they don't call each other. And then before any disease advice goes out, we have the review crop diagnosis independent agent so that it reviews it. And then the escalation function is actually going to decide if we need to have a real person speaking to the farmer for something. Otherwise, the advice might make it worse. The reviewer has no access to the entire conversational history by design. If it could read what the first agent said, it would anchor with that. And we know that with AI, that happens a lot. It gets biased very quickly. The escalation function is separate and testable rather than something that's an inline condition, because we need to be able to verify it without running the handler again. So the tool layer is really where things get really useful, right? So with tools, we get the weather and we get the farm data. For the weather, we were very careful in the description that when it should be used, and that's what it's kind of doing. And with farm data, we were more lax. We said just get the farm data for anything, because you always need to know the current operational data of the farm, inputs, revenue, profits, and all the different levels in terms of moisture and so on, to understand we are with giving advice. So the evaluations were something that the evals answered a question that I didn't know to ask before starting this, right? So I guess if you were to do this, start with evals in your mind as to if you're making an agent, how would you test it? How would you think of testing it? Sending test messages one by one is not scalable, which is how we started at first. But if you pull the escalation function out of the handler and test it with 4 cases and no API calls, that's a very good system. That's what we did. It was instantaneous. It did not cost us. It was very reproducible. And towards the end, we put in a really big feature, which was the photo input, right? A farmer is always going to be standing in field, and they are going to have the phone with them, because this is a bot on WhatsApp, and there is a diseased plant in front of them. They're typing a description, and the bot doesn't get it. The very stereotypical advice of a picture is worth 1,000 words. So Meta does this very well. Claude does this very well with photo upload and analysis. So the reasoning about what to do with the disease finding is already there. So no. So all of that ends up being the same structure regardless of what you build on top of it, right? So you could do routing, specialist handlers, safety checks, tools, evals, and a file that explains the decision, the specific API hosting provider. So 15 episodes for a bot and 1 farm for one farm. The code works, the tests are passing, and there's a file that explains the decisions to whoever opens this project next, including me, and tells me if I've forgotten why the escalation function is like this or like that. So this is the end, and I loved making this, and I hope that this gave you an idea of the architecture required to help a small business build automation in their enterprise. And halfway through, I even came to know that they probably need to chat in groups, and the Meta API does not support groups. So we might switch to Telegram as a version 2 of this particular app building, and hopefully I'll make something about that. Stay tuned, and I'll post more stuff. Thank you so much, and thank you for being with me in this journey.